In this chapter, Aristotle provides a fuller account of what he understands as the mean. The doctrine of the mean is Aristotle's normative ethical theory, and is characterized by an appropriateness to the ethical situation and an intermediacy between the maximal and the deficient. Here are some of the key elements of the mean. First, the mean is derived from a moral agent's disposition, as we've seen already. The mean is a rational principle, meaning it is intellectually calculated. It is also relative to each person and each situation. The mean is the definition of moral virtue and its excellent practice. The mean provides us with a blueprint for action, and the mean is when one's function is at its optimum, meaning its most excellent. Now, at the beginning of chapter 6, Aristotle distinguishes between the mean, between two objects, or a mathematical mean, and the intermediate between the two vicious extremes of excess and defect, which is relative to us. What he means by this is that the intermediate is determined by the agent's context. In any situation, the intermediate may call for extreme caution or great anger, such as when one is a witness to torture. Through habit and expertise, we will learn to have these feelings, as Aristotle says, at the right times, with reference to the right objects, towards the right people, with the right motive and in the right way, as this is what is intermediate and best, and this is characteristic of virtue. Now, those who have mastered their respective arts are able to locate the mean relatively, and moral virtue is no different to any other art. In standard form, this argument looks like this. So we can say that Aristotle is relativist in the sense that he believes the intermediate is context-based, rather than an absolutist that thinks that there are rules of virtue that can apply in every case. However, this does not make him a subjectivist. His method is still an objective one, in that we are to use a rational principle, being the mean, to determine right action. Reason will impose the right action in a situation, and any man of virtue would, and should, in the same context, do the same thing. Thus, virtue aims at the intermediate between two vices, rather than being the opposite of vice. And this is known as a triadic split, and it is in place of the usual dualistic split between a virtue and a vice. And the fact that virtue is in a mean is characteristic of the Greek relativist, situation-based view of ethics. And Aristotle finally sums it up in the following phrase. Virtue is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean, the mean relative to us, this being determined by reason, and by that reason by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. And standard form, the whole argument looks like this. Now, after this conclusion concerning virtue and the mean, Aristotle goes on to admit that not every action or feeling admits of a mean. This means that some actions are just base or bad, and therefore have no excess or defect, and he lists things such as adultery, theft, and murder. This seems moralistic, and presumably reason has led him to pronounce these things as bad, but he does not use the mean to determine this. His criteria is unclear. Now, finally, at the end of this chapter, in order to avoid infinite regress, Aristotle claims that there cannot be a mean for excess and deficiency, so we cannot continue to split acts into triads. In other words, the excess is always excessive and cannot have its own excess and defect. Now, in chapter 7, Aristotle famously moves through the doctrine of the mean with reference to a range of examples. He begins with a habit of feeling an action, such as modesty, and then identifies the excess, defect, and mean. In the case of modesty, the mean is to be modest, while the deficiency lies in being bashful, and the excess is to be shameless. And here are some other examples. Now, chapter 8 is concerned with the notion of contrariety and proving how each part of the triadic structure of virtue, excess, and defect stands contrary to each other, rather than the common dualistic virtue-vice split that was common at the time. He makes it clear that all three stand contrary to each other, but that the greatest contrast is between excess and defect, as they lie the furthest from each other. Therefore, in the case of modesty, to be modest is to stand in contrast to both bashfulness and shamelessness, while the latter two stand in stark contrast to each other. And to further account for complexity, he also acknowledges that some intermediates lie closer to one of the extremes than the other. i.e. the mean operates more like a sliding rule rather than the intermediate occupying a dead centre position. For example, the virtue of courage resembles the excess rashness, and thus lies closer to it than it does the defect, cowardice. And you can see he's presuming counter-arguments here. In chapter 9, Aristotle finally considers how we go about hitting the mean, linking back indirectly to his archer analogy from Book 1. However, he acknowledges that it is not easy, which is why goodness is such a laudable notion according to him. However, he does offer us some tips. First, he suggests we try to avoid the extremes, then we are most likely to find the mean. However, we might naturally tend towards some kinds of errors due to our own psychology, so to guard against this we need to aim for the opposing vice, and by doing so we'll drag ourselves towards the intermediate. Second, we need to be careful of pleasure, because it can easily lead us astray. In addition, sometimes by aiming towards the vice, which is sometimes easier to see, such as overeating for example, and then tempering it, we have a better chance of hitting the mean. So, with these guidelines, Aristotle is taking on the role of an archery coach, you could say, except when thinking of moral choice, the target is always moving, and we need to be able to adapt to follow it. And this adds context to his final remarks in Book 2, where he states that up to what point and to what extent a man may deviate before he becomes blameworthy is not easy to determine by reasoning, any more than anything else that is perceived by the senses, as such things depend on particular facts, and the decision rests with perception. There is a crucial point about moral epistemology here. Aristotle is saying that the judgment required in deciding whether or not a man is behaving appropriately or morally cannot be reasoned from principles. The deciding, in fact, rests with perception. Now this, vague as it seems, puts the onus completely on the agent, and their disposition that has been cultivated through action, as our perception will ultimately be shaped by our empirical experiences. It also quite clearly puts him at odds with Plato, who believed that the good could be deduced via reason.